So good evening. Good evening. So what Dan and I thought we would do is I'm going to start and I'm going to sort of take us back in time a little bit because it's been a really tumultuous decade for transportation in Massachusetts. In fact, at some level, I think the governor would probably like nothing more than not to have transportation be a major issue for a few years, but that's unlikely to occur. So what I want to do is sort of review what's been going on and create some context for the discussion about what might be going on during the second term. And then Dan is going to step in and talk about what he sees, you know, the kind of advice he would give to the governor, and then we'll sort of all circle back before the break and add a little bit to that. So, you know, transportation is a policy area where people like numbers. They like big numbers, millions of vehicles, billions of miles, gallons of gas. But I mean, the transportation system is really very large. It's the largest physical asset that the Commonwealth owns. The MBTA is the largest owner of real estate in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It's both the largest and the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions. So the transportation sector is really important, and it's of course fundamental to the economy of Massachusetts. So one of the things about transportation policy is that it's often not actually about transportation. It's actually about how transportation is a factor in other policy areas like economic growth, sprawl, climate change, etc. There's sort of a couple of pieces of history that I think help people understand how we got to where we are today, which is, as you'll hear, a fairly depressing situation. Just about 4 years ago now, I was co-chairing Governor Patrick's first transition around transportation. We had the opportunity to sort of delve into where things were, and I felt like all I did was deliver bad news to the incoming administration. 4 years later, it's worse. So I'm going to start in 2000. Through the 80s and 1990s, the transportation was not a huge issue. We were, except for building the Big D. That was kind of the transportation issue of the 90s in Massachusetts. But the other sort of emerging issue was this problem that the funding, particularly for the MBTA, was becoming a growing sort of pain for the state legislature. We had a system under which the MBTA would basically go out, set a budget, spend what it spent, and then come to the legislature at the end of every year and basically get a check for the difference between how much it spent and how much revenue it brought in. Eventually this became perceived to be a so-called budget buster, and the legislature decided it was time to change the way in which we finance transit. And so they passed legislation that's usually referred to as forward funding, and they switched the system around and they said, okay, here's the deal. We're going to give you your own revenue source. That revenue source is 1 penny of the then 5-cent gasoline tax. It's worth about $500 million a year. Now that you have that money, go off and live within your means. And every year, the combination of the fare revenue you bring in and the money from this penny of the sales tax, you should be able to run the transit system. And by the way, in addition to operating the transit system, you should actually also be able to take care of the maintenance and the expansion of the system. So we're going to give the MBTA the ability. You know, the good news is we're going to give you the ability to issue bonds and have your own capital program, and the bad news is we're going to make you pay for your own capital program, which had not previously been the case. But quite honestly, and I was involved in the debates over forward funding in 2000, the thinking was much more about the operating side and much less about the capital side and the bond issue, which is the one that sort of came back to bite. And, you know, I sometimes feel bad for the MBTA. I feel like it's like that character in the old Charlie Brown comic strips that always had the little black cloud over its head. Because when we were debating this issue of which revenue source should be bequeathed upon the MBTA, the choice was very deliberately made to be the sales tax, because at that point it had been growing at between 3 and 7% a year every year for decades. And so we thought, this is great, guarantees growth. The first year that the sales tax grew less than 3% in Massachusetts in 30 years was the year that a fifth of it belonged to the MBTA, and in fact has never achieved the levels that were projected for it at the time of forward funding. So we thought it would grow 3% a year. It's grown 1% a year or less. We thought that T would be able to shave operating costs by about 2% a year. In fact, they continued to increase. We thought that they would run a balanced budget. In fact, they're running deficits. And actually, the idea was is that the T would generate surpluses of 5 to 10% of its budget every year, and then reinvest that into maintenance and expansion, so that some of the capital program would be financed on what was called a pay-as-you-go basis, so that you didn't have to issue bonds. So that was the game plan, that was the thinking. None of it essentially materialized 10 years later, and that has implications for transportation policy in Massachusetts in the next year. So that's one piece of history. But it turns out that the MBTA was not the only transportation agency in Massachusetts that was happily running up credit card bills for most of the decade of the 1990s. So was the highway agency, and so was the Turnpike Authority, and so was all the other agencies. And so in about 1996 and 1997, then Governor Romney created, working with the legislature, created a commission to examine the state of transportation finance in Massachusetts across all the agencies and ask two questions. One was, how much should we be spending on transportation? How much should we actually be investing in our transportation infrastructure in order to keep up what we have and grow as necessary? And how much revenue can we actually expect to generate from the existing ways in which we finance the system, which were largely the gas tax and this penny on the sales tax that the MBTA gets, and tolls and fares that the MBTA charge? And if there was a gap between those two numbers, how should we fill that gap? So the Finance Commission met basically throughout the Romney administration, and actually more or less had its report done before the gubernatorial election. The commission met in the mid-2000s, but decided to wait because they figured coming out with the report right in the middle of the election season was not a good idea. So literally immediately after Governor Patrick was elected, the commission started to the information started to leak that the commission had found an immense gap, and in fact, what they ended up coming out with in early 2007, they waited until after the inauguration, was an estimate that we were basically falling behind in round numbers by $1 billion a year. The difference between what we were spending and what we should be spending was $1 billion, and that assumed no expansion of the system. So the $1 billion a year was just to run the system and to maintain the assets we had. It didn't include building anything. And the commission said we need to grasp the enormity of the problem, recognize business as usual will not suffice, and work together to develop sustainable solutions. And the commission sort of did its work in two pieces. They came out with one report and they said, here's what we found, and here's our analysis, and here's all the numbers we've crunched. And they held hearings around the state, and then later in the year they came out with their recommendations, and they broke their recommendations into two pieces. One set of recommendations concerns what they referred to as reforms, how you could change the system to make it work better, and administer it better and govern itself better. And then 6 recommendations which they euphemistically entitled revitalization, which meant revenue. And so quickly we came up with this debate in Massachusetts, which became the revenue versus reform debate. Do we do reform first? Do we do revenue first? Do we do reform or revenue at the same time? The commission report basically found that on the highway side, on the road side, of that sort of $15 to $19 billion deficit, about $10 billion of it was on the road side. On the transit side, we're basically falling behind by about $1 billion a year. We have what's called a backlog of what's called state of good repair, what we should be spending to keep the system up. That's, depending on who you believe, somewhere between $2.7 and $3 billion. Now, so on the reform side, they made a whole bunch of recommendations, many of which, in fact, were then taken up by the state legislature, and some of which were implemented by the various transportation agencies without legislative approval. And in fact, the current Secretary of Transportation, who will continue as Secretary, we went through 3 transportation secretaries in the first Patrick administration, but the one who is still standing at the end, Jeff Mullen, will remain Transportation Secretary, at least going into the second administration. So they recently actually sort of did a scorecard, and they went back and they looked at what the commission had recommended back in 2007, and at least by their count, most of the recommendations related to reform have been either fully or partially implemented. But on the revenue recommendations, nothing. No new revenue has been provided, and so we're actually falling farther and farther behind every year on the revenue side, because the revenue recommendation was the 2 big ones were to increase the gas tax, the gasoline tax, which has not been touched since the early 1990s and has lost most of its purchasing power as a result, and to actually start to implement what they called open road tolling, the idea that people would be charged per mile for driving on the roads in Massachusetts. Neither of those went anywhere. The governor actually did recommend a large gas tax increase, larger than the Transportation Finance Commission recommendation, which was around 11 cents. The commission, by the way, picked 11.5 cents, not out of a hat, but because that would have put the gas tax's purchasing power back to where it was the last time it was raised in 1991. The governor decided to go for 19 cents. It went nowhere. The legislature did give a little bit of extra sales tax money to both the Turnpike Authority and the T, but basically no new revenue sources. However, the legislature took to this reform idea, and thus the sort of reform before revenue was sort of the winner in the policy debate, and they enacted a substantial transportation reform bill in 2009. And as of 2009, instead of having a separate Massachusetts Turnpike Authority and a separate Board of Highway Commissioners and all these sort of pieces that the transportation system in Massachusetts had, all the agencies were consolidated, or most of the agencies were consolidated. We have now a single Massachusetts Department of Transportation called MassDOT. The MBTA remains as an independent authority, and the Mass Port Authority remains as an independent port authority, but everything else is mushed together, and it's this very interesting agency because it is simultaneously a line agency. It's a cabinet agency to the governor. The Secretary of Transportation is appointed by the governor, like the secretary of every other agency is, but at the same time, it's not a line agency of the government, so the Secretary of Transportation is also accountable to a 5-person board of directors, and that 5-person board of directors is not only the board of the transportation agency, it's also simultaneously, although in separate meetings, the 5-person board of the MBTA. So it's a sort of unique structure you know the saying, a camel is a horse that was designed by a committee. So this is a structure that was designed by the legislative committee to sort of take, some of the concern over how do you create accountability in an agency that was seen as being not accountable. So you want accountability to the governor, but you also want independence from the governor. And this was the structure that they came up with, and this agency just recently celebrated its first anniversary, and it's come up with these wonderful statements. It's got a mission, and it's got values, and it's got a goal statement. From a policy perspective, it's not a particularly policy-oriented agency. Its mission and goals are all about, we're going to run the transportation system well, and we're going to make people not be mad at us anymore. Is how I would sort of summarize it, because people have been mad at us for so long, like just having faith in us would be a huge accomplishment for our agency. So, which is true, but as a policy person, a little bit disappointing to me. But so most of the first year of the Massachusetts Department of Transportation was devoted to creating the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, and you should not underestimate the difficulty of that effort with multiple agencies and unions and agendas and accountability, and no new revenue, right? No new revenue, doing all of this with existing revenue. So they spent about a year, and now what we have is this super transportation agency, and it's divided into 4 pieces. One piece focuses on our roads, and it's all the roads. It's the roads, it includes the Tobin Bridge, which used to belong to Massport. It includes the Turnpike, which used to belong to its own independent authority. It includes a bunch of, not all, but a bunch of parkways and bridges that used to belong to the old MDC, and then the Division of Conservation and Recreation. So we put the roads together, and we have a road division, and then we took the T and the regional transit authorities and the freight and passenger rail people, and we created a rail and mass transit piece, and then there's an aeronautics piece that replaced what used to be the separate Mass Aeronautics Commission, and then there's the Registry of Motor Vehicles. And so now they're all the 4 pieces of this one big Massachusetts Department of Transportation. The other interesting thing as background that you should know, and I'll turn it over to Dan in a moment, is that we also created, we used to have a highway fund, and you would collect all the gas taxes and you'd toss them into the highway fund, and then you would spend them on highways, and then over the years we spent some of it on transit, but it was still always called the highway fund. And instead, one of the good things I would say that came out of reform is the legislature created a much bigger pot called the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, and it tossed everything in the pot. It tossed the gas tax money in the fund, and all the registry fees in the fund, and the sales tax in the fund. And the fund's first obligation is that it has to pay all the debt, the MBTA's debt, the Turnpike's old debt, everybody's debt. which honestly is over $1 billion, is about $1 billion, sorry, is about $1 billion a year, so that's where a lot of the money is going. But over time, it does create a structure where if we start to talk about new revenue sources, we now have a mechanism in place for sort of putting all the revenue sources in, prioritizing what we want to spend it on, and spending the money on that. So that's a good thing. That's the Commonwealth Transportation Fund. But the question, really one of the burning questions that's going to face the new governor is, okay, so if we did the reform, when do we get to the revenue? Do we get to the revenue? Are we there yet? Do we get there a year from now? Do we get there 3 years from now? While it's an issue for all of the transportation agencies, it's a particularly pressing issue for the MBTA because under the forward funding legislation that I told you about a few moments ago, the MBTA can't run a deficit anymore. It has to make up its own budget every year, and its budget consists of the penny on the sales tax, which has not generated as much money, and fares, and a couple of other little sources of money, but that's pretty much it. So the problem is if those revenue sources do not add up to what it costs to run the system, there's a hole, and the hole has to get filled in every year. You can't just sort of say, oh, we didn't quite make it this year, we'll try to do a better job next year. And this is a projection of the size of the operating hole that was done by an independent review that Governor Patrick asked David D'Alessandro, formerly of the John Hancock Company, to do a year or so ago. And you see there's a sort of a giant hole and a not quite as giant hole, and that depends because the legislature gave the MBTA an extra $160 million when it increased the sales tax from 5% to 6.25%. But that money is not the T's money in the same way that the penny is. The penny is the T's. It can't be taken away. It's actually used as collateral in bonds. It would be pretty hard. There were some people who said even if, God forbid, we had rolled the sales tax back to 3 cents in the last election, the T would still have one of those 3 cents because you can't take it away. But the $160 million is just like a gift from the legislature that may be renewed or may not be renewed. So if we renew the gift, then we're only like half $500 million in the hole over the next 3 years. And if we don't renew the gift, then the T is over $1 billion in the hole over the next 3 years. So it is inconceivable that Governor Patrick will get through calendar year 2011 without raising fares, cutting service, or finding a new source of revenue for the MBTA. If I were to bet in a pool right now, I would bet February board meeting for a proposed, the beginning of the process of proposing a fare increase. January is too soon. I would bet February. So there's this big operating problem at the T, and then the second problem, which relates to the first problem, is remember I told you the T in forward funding got both the pleasure and the burden of becoming its own capital agency as well as an operating agency. So the T has $5.5 billion in outstanding debt. That's principal only with interest, $8.6 billion. Far and away the largest debt load of any transit system in the United States of America. The debt service payments constitute about a quarter of the MBTA's entire budget. Roughly speaking, in round numbers, every penny they collect in fares, they spend paying bonds and don't have any of it left to run the system. But what's even scarier than the fact that this year that's true is if you look at this table, what it shows you is that through the year 2022, the debt service payments will be a minimum of $400 million for an agency that has a budget of roughly $1.5 billion. So in addition to dealing with the operating deficit, we got to do something about debt. So I'm going to stop there because that sort of brings us to where we stand here on December 1st, 2010, and I'm going to give Dan a chance to address what he would tell Governor Patrick about a bunch of the issues that I've sort of outlined for you.